By this time, who doesn't know about Uber? Sure, the fare might be a bit over the top at times, but the convenience is worth it. In fact, it's probably become a regular thing for millions of people around the world. Having said that, the company recently got fined $21 million by the federal court for misleading consumers. In this video, we're going to tell you everything you need to know about this, so stay tuned. First off, Uber has been misleading its customers. It's official, y'all. Uber has been fined a whopping $21 million because they've been doing something sneaky all this time. It turns out the company hasn't been very honest and was in fact misleading its customers about their fare estimates and trip cancellation fees. Sound familiar? Turns out the gut feeling you had about being charged way too much was right after all. On top of that, here's the shocking bit. Uber expected the company to do a lot more than this. Initially, the case was launched by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC for short, back in April, which was just a few months ago. And it didn't take long for Uber to finally admit that it had indeed misled or even gone to the extent of deceiving its customers. Adding to that, let's just say that both parties had filed joint submissions, and they were expecting a $26 million fine against Uber. But eventually the court decided that considering the circumstances, $26 million was pretty steep. Well, $21 million is still a pretty big number, but alright. Having said that, it was a rather unusual case, one you don't see around too often. And when making his decision, Justice Michael O'Brien agreed to that too, which is probably why he set a lower penalty. But also, let's not forget that both parties didn't even have a lot of evidence to justify the higher penalty anyway. And as for the ACCC, they failed to prove customers had suffered significant harm. Well, if you ask us, misleading or not, this definitely has a huge impact individually, which wasn't really highlighted in the case to begin with. Following up, the deceiving cancellation warnings. Now, we've all been at the point where, because of something or other, we ended up canceling an Uber ride. And boy, do they take a look at that cancellation fee? It turns out they do, and pretty close on at that. Now, a consumer regulator claimed that from about December 2017 all the way to September 2021, Uber's app started displaying a misleading cancellation warning. Confused? Let us explain. So whenever customers tried to cancel their bookings for whatever reason, even the most valid ones, they'd always get a prompt saying something that might ring a bell. You may be charged a small fee since your driver is already on their way. Sound familiar? And let's not forget that Uber has a free cancellation period of 5 minutes. So if you cancel a ride within that time frame, you should be good to go, right? Well, instead, they'd still get the same warning. On top of that, the ACCC confirmed that over 2 million Australian customers were shown the misleading cancellation warning on the Uber app. And before you ask, yes, this evidence was shown in court at the time of legal proceedings. But despite the misleading warnings, Justice O'Brien found that Uber didn't really charge its customers fees if they canceled within the first 5 minutes. In fact, only about 0.4% of customers, which is a pretty small number for a case like this, were influenced by misleading warnings. And when we say influenced, we mean they ended up proceeding with their booking instead of canceling them. So maybe that wasn't that big of a deal, right? Not to mention the inaccurate fare estimates. Considering the misleading cancellation fee, the court decided that maybe $18 million was a pretty appropriate penalty for this sort of conduct, albeit in the higher range. But that's not all. It turns out that Uber wasn't so honest about one more thing. Along with the cancellation fees, the company also admitted that it misled customers about its Uber taxi ride option. First, it was only available in Sydney, so don't be too shocked if this is the first time you've heard of this. Second, the company gave out price estimates that were pretty inaccurate and way too high. Here's an example. Let's just say the app might have given customers a price estimate of about $300 for a $40 ride under its taxi option. But let's not forget that the actual fare paid by customers would almost always fall below that range, say $25 or so. Now, whether it caused a huge financial loss or not, the estimates were still pretty misleading, and you could see them between June 2018 and August 2020, after which the feature was removed entirely from the app. And whether that was because of the pandemic or because they were saving themselves from a legal issue, we're not too sure. As for Justice O'Brien, he found the company to have overestimated the Uber taxi fares about 89% of the time. And that means the customers were definitely paying less, so they suffered no detriment. Ultimately, the court ordered that Uber needs to pay $3 million for this contravention of the Australian consumer law, which is still a huge drop from the $8 million penalty that both parties had initially sought. Coming up, why why did Uber do this in the first place? If the fares weren't misleading, Uber would have made a huge profit out of this, but it also would have ended up as a more serious case, with higher penalties and whatnot. So why do any of that at all? Well, the misleading estimates made sure customers were sort of forced to book their ride anyway. For instance, even if it's within the 5-minute cancellation period, if you were to see a warning like that pop up on your screen, you might as well deal with the situation rather than risk fees for nothing. On top of that, they saved a bunch of canceled rides with this strategy. As for the inaccurate fare estimates for the Uber taxi option, that's a confusing bit, because why would they increase fares so ridiculously high to the point most customers are just going to walk away from it anyway? Well, it's all about the sense of gratification. Once you end up booking an Uber ride prepared to give $300 only to reach your destination and have the fare total up to $30, you think, wow, that's a steal, even though it's not. Having said that, the company issued a public apology, saying they proactively made changes to their platform based on these concerns. On top of that, they discontinued the Uber taxi option as well, while making the cancellation message a lot more direct and clear, so the riders always have certainty. On top of that, this serves as a good example for other businesses that misleading consumers about the cost of a product or service isn't a small thing, but a serious matter that's going to result in substantial penalties. Up next, Uber has been held accountable for a lot of controversies. Let's just say all that we talked about is still a small sample of Uber's misdeeds. This case is yet another example of the company's shady behavior. In fact, it entered markets around the world knowing that licensed taxis had a government-decreed monopoly on personal transport services, and ever since then, it's been penalized for deceptive advertising in France, overcharging disabled customers, and exposing customers' data in a massive leak that the CSO even tried covering up. So maybe it's time for the company to rethink its marketing campaigns. On top of that, talking about the most recent one, Uber still has to answer for a massive cloud failure from back in September 2022 and the deceiving investigators. Clearly, there's a lot going on here. As for the current case over misleading cancellation fees and inaccurate fare estimates, the company will also have to pay about $200,000 toward the ACCC's cost of prosecuting the case. On top of that, it also needs to publish the corrections while implementing a compliance program regarding the Australian consumer law. As of now, Uber has 30 days to pay the penalties. Finally, Uber to launch robo-taxi service in Las Vegas. It turns out that the company hasn't given up hope yet. It turns out Uber and driverless tech maker Motional are set to launch their public robotaxi after delayed deployment. On top of that, the launch is going to be a part of a non-exclusive 10-year agreement between the companies for driverless vehicles. Along with that, the multi-market deal is also expected to ferry both passengers and delivery items for Uber and its Uber Eats divisions. So while it's definitely a great initiative in terms of marketing and company growth, after all the controversies, can we even trust the company anymore? The cases lined up have definitely impacted Uber's reputation. That's a wrap for this video. What's your take on Uber being fined $21 million by the federal court for misleading customers? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.